Hi, welcome back to the channel. The war in Iran is now having consequences far beyond the Middle East, and one of the biggest unintended winners from this crisis could actually be Russia. In today's episode, I'd like to talk to you about the continuing developments in the war in Iran, the impact this is now having on the global economy, and discuss the fact that there is now a real possibility that the current sanctions on Russian oil exports could be lifted in order to stabilise global oil markets. As a direct result of the incredible turmoil that we've seen in the oil markets and global financial markets over the last few days, Donald Trump has now come out and said that he believes the mission is largely complete and that the war could soon be coming to an end. Those comments appear to be aimed at calming the markets after the dramatic spike in oil prices that we saw earlier this week. Oil prices surged to almost $120 per barrel, triggering serious concerns about the impact this could have on inflation and the global economy. But following Donald Trump's comments, oil prices have now fallen sharply and are currently trading at around $90 per barrel, and global stock markets have started to recover. So investors are clearly hoping that this conflict might be nearing its conclusion. But the big question right now is whether that optimism is justified or whether this is just simply an attempt by the United States to calm the markets after the shock that we've seen recently. Because if you look at what Iran is doing, it doesn't look like a country that is preparing to end this war. In fact, Iran appears to be pursuing a very different strategy. Rather than trying to take on the United States head-to-head in a direct military confrontation, Iran appears to be targeting the global economy itself. Instead of attacking the United States directly, Iran has been focusing on oil infrastructure, shipping routes, and energy supply chains across the Middle East. In other words, what we may actually be seeing here is economic warfare. And if that really is the strategy, the implications for the global economy could be enormous. Now, there is another major geopolitical development here that could have huge consequences. Because when you look at what's happening in the oil markets right now, this crisis might end up having serious implications far beyond the Middle East, particularly for the ongoing war in Ukraine. In an effort to calm the oil markets, Donald Trump has indicated that the United States may temporarily lift certain oil-related sanctions in order to increase global supply and stabilise prices. And this comes immediately after a lengthy telephone conversation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, during which the two leaders reportedly discussed the current crisis in global energy markets and possible ways to stabilise oil supplies. Now, officially, the White House hasn't confirmed exactly which sanctions could be lifted. But if you look at the global oil market right now, the answer is fairly obvious. Most of the major oil producers in the Middle East are cutting production because of the war. Iran is obviously not an option because it's directly involved in the conflict. Venezuela has already been partially brought back into the system, and in any case, the United States has now significant influence over the Venezuelan oil production, which really leaves only one major source of additional supply that is currently sanctioned: Russia. And according to reports from Washington, the Trump administration is now actively considering easing sanctions on Russian oil exports in order to cool global energy prices. And if that happens, it would represent a very significant shift in policy, because those sanctions were originally introduced to punish Russia for its invasion of Ukraine and to limit the amount of revenue that Russia earns from oil exports. But if those sanctions are relaxed in order to stabilise global oil prices, then we could find ourselves in the extraordinary situation where a war in Iran ends up strengthening the Russian economy, which is obviously the exact opposite of what those sanctions were designed to achieve. And if Russia suddenly finds itself earning significantly higher revenues from oil exports again, then the financial pressure that those sanctions were designed to create would effectively disappear, which would also mean that there would be no obvious economic incentive for Russia to bring the war in Ukraine to an end. So one of the unintended consequences of this conflict in Iran could actually be that it prolongs the war in Ukraine, simply because Russia would once again have the financial resources to continue funding the conflict. And that would be a disastrous unintended outcome of the war in Iran, given the enormous amount of effort that has gone into imposing those sanctions on Russia and trying to bring an end to the war in Ukraine over the last few years. Now, the starting point for the disruption that we're seeing right now is the Strait of Hormuz. This is one of the most important shipping routes in the world, with around 20% of global oil and gas supplies passing through this narrow channel every single day. And since the war escalated, shipping through this region has been severely disrupted. Tanker operations have been avoiding the area because it has effectively become a conflict zone, and that means large volumes of oil are now struggling to reach global markets. But that isn't the only problem. At the same time that shipping has been disrupted, a number of major oil-producing countries in the region have also been forced to cut production. Iraq has reportedly reduced production by around 2.9 million barrels per day, which is the largest reduction so far. Saudi Arabia has cut around 2 million barrels per day. The United Arab Emirates has reduced production by 800,000 per day, and Kuwait has cut by 500,000. And when you add all of that together, we're looking at roughly 6 to 7 million barrels of oil per day being removed from the global oil market. To put that into context, global oil demand is currently around 100 million barrels per day. So this represents between 6 and 7% of global supply disappearing overnight. And that's exactly why oil prices surged so dramatically. As I mentioned at the start of today's video, at the height of the panic, prices climbed to $120 per barrel as traders started to price in the possibility that this disruption could last for weeks or even months. But then Donald Trump made his comments suggesting that the mission was largely complete and that the war may soon be coming to an end. And that immediately changed the mood in the financial markets. Oil prices dropped sharply, stock markets rallied, and investors started betting that the worst case scenario might not happen. But the reality of the situation remains extremely uncertain, because while the United States may want a quick resolution, Iran appears to be preparing for something very different. Iran has indicated that it's prepared for a war of endurance, and that suggests that its strategy may be to create prolonged disruption in global energy markets. This approach is actually very similar to what we've seen in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine cannot defeat Russia militarily, so instead it's focused on attacking Russia's oil infrastructure, refineries, ports, and export facilities in order to damage Russia economically. Iran appears to be applying a similar strategy. Rather than trying to defeat the United States militarily, it may be trying to create economic pressure by disrupting global energy markets. Now, the problem with that strategy is that it doesn't just affect the United States. It affects every country in the world. High oil prices increase transportation costs, they push up manufacturing costs, they increase electricity and heating bills, and they ultimately feed directly into inflation. Central banks are already struggling to bring inflation back under control after the shocks of the past few years. So another major oil spike could make that situation much worse. And that's exactly why markets reacted so strongly to Trump's comments suggesting the war might soon be over. Investors are desperate to believe that this crisis will stabilise quickly. But even if the war ended tomorrow, the disruption to oil supply chains could take months to repair. Production would need to ramp back up, shipping routes would need to reopen, and tanker operators would need to regain confidence that it's safe to return to the region. So even in the best case scenario, the economic effects of this crisis could continue to impact the global economy throughout 2026. And of course, the biggest risk is that the conflict continues, because if we do see a prolonged war here, then this could have very serious consequences for the global economy. A sustained disruption to global oil supplies could keep energy prices elevated for months, and that significantly increases the risk that the global economy could be pushed into a global recession during 2026. So while markets may have rallied on Trump's comments overnight, this story is far from over, and the global economy is now watching very closely to see whether diplomacy can bring a rapid end to the conflict or whether this war turns into a much longer economic battle. Because if the disruption to global energy markets continues, the consequences could be extremely significant. Now, as always, I'll keep you fully updated on what happens as soon as there's any major developments. But hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you did like what I said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the channel. Don't forget I'm currently running my competition, whereby you can win my property or a cash alternative prize. You scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below. You can get involved in that, and it's another way of funding the channel. Thank you so much to everyone that's supported me in other ways. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much for that support. Really do appreciate it. And here's something to put a smile on your face.